Hello, it's Scott Weber.
Hi, Scott. This is Daniel Sowards. How are you?
Hey, Daniel. How are you?
Good, thanks. We're going to get started in just a little bit here.
Great.
And Scott, I have your presentation, but you can share it on your screen as well, but whichever is more comfortable for you.
Actually, if you've got it up, it's just a few slides, right? So I'll just ask you to go to the next slide, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Thanks.
Yep.
Is the video of me streaming live, or is that just, am I just seeing that?
You're just seeing that, unless I move, yeah.
All right, that's fine.
For those that have joined us, if you can just put your mic on mute until the end of the webinar, and we'll have a question and answer period at the end where you can either message in your questions or you can just voice your opinion. And we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, we're going to get started here, everyone. Thank you all for joining our webinar today. This is really exciting to have the opportunity to do these webinars on a quarterly basis for the UACME, so I appreciate everyone who is on for making the time to attend. We might keep hearing a couple beeps as people join in, but I think we have the majority of individuals. To get started, before we have the presenters go, I just wanted to remind everyone to add to their calendar the annual meeting, which will be held on May 19th of this year down at the Intermountain Medical Center in Murray. We're going to be in the Doty Education Center in the auditorium. So that's going to be a great opportunity for all of us to meet together and hear some really dynamic speakers. We are finalizing the agenda for the conference, and as I mentioned in the email earlier today, anyone who has any thoughts or ideas that they'd like to see in the annual meeting, please feel free to email me, or we'll have a period at the end of this webinar as long as we're under time to voice those ideas. We're really trying to meet the needs of all CME providers within our area, so any ideas are welcome. So to get started, let me just quickly introduce our speakers. First, we're going to have Scott Weber, and he is the CEO of MedIQ. He was kind enough to agree to speak with us today, and he's a leading force in the CME world. We're then going to hear from Vanessa Ross, and she is the Director of Continuing Medical Education. And lastly, we'll hear from Mike Nguyen, who is our outcomes analyst in the CME office at Intermountain Healthcare. So we'll start with Scott, and I'm going to try to pull up his presentation, so bear with me as I do that. Okay, Scott, does that look right?
That's perfect, thanks.
Okay.
So thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for the invite to join you today. We had a great session just last month down in DC for the Alliance annual meeting. I was asked to do a panel discussion around headwinds and tailwinds that are facing the CME enterprise as we move into 2016, and I was fortunate enough to have a panel that included Norm Kahn from the Council of Medical Specialty Societies, Nancy Painter, who runs education for Genentech, and Ed Dellert, who was the outgoing president of the Alliance and the head of education over at the American Chess Society. And the whole point of the headwinds and tailwinds discussion really focused in on this notion that really great organizations.
Today's session was just as uneventful as yesterday.
If everyone can mute their audio, sorry, as a reminder, just mute your audio. Thanks.
So the point of the whole discussion was that great organizations spend a lot of time at the beginning of certain cycles, whether it's an annual cycle or a fiscal cycle or whatever type of cycle it might be, really looking at taking inventory and the challenges and opportunities that those organizations face. And ideally what the goal is that if you understand, in fact, where the momentum is coming, the tailwinds that are creating forward movement and progress in your organization, and you understand the headwinds, those forces that are working against you, that ideally then success can be achieved if, of course, both are managed in the appropriate way. One of the things, as the chairman of the advocacy committee for the Alliance, one of the things that I spend a lot of time on with education providers is really trying to get our members to understand their own internal and external headwinds and tailwinds, and what are those things that are impacting our ability to develop and deliver education that's ultimately going to make a difference in patient outcomes. And so as Sarah Ann has heard me in the past, I'm very passionate about the work that we do in the enterprise. I believe that everybody on this call and every member of the Alliance ultimately is impacting healthcare in this country. We have to learn how to tell our story better. And this was a big part of some of this discussion. So what I'm going to take you through here, the slides, you'll be pleased to know there's only a few of them, and they only have essentially a few words on each. And I'm just going to share with you the discussion that took place there and really some takeaways for you as you leave this call. So if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide, that'd be great. So sunshine. So naturally, this was a part of our discussion as far as both a headwind and a tailwind. And what was fascinating is that we had the panelists really share a perspective around sunshine, and we had some feedback from the audience. But what I found interesting, and I think everybody came away with, is that sunshine has been, the Physician Payment Sunshine Act has been such a controversial topic in the enterprise for the past few years. And primarily it's been controversial not because of the transparency that it was designed to create, but how it was being interpreted and how it was being expressed by CMS to the provider in the education community. And even to this day, there still exists some confusion. But what came out of this was a feeling from the panelists that we have arrived in a place now where there is some clarity around what is to be reported and not to be reported. There was also discussion around the need for this type of transparency, and that we have evolved as an enterprise in the standards for commercial support, in the work that we're doing. We have evolved to a place that we should all embrace this transparency and make it clear to those both internal and external to the CME environment that the work that we're doing is fair balanced, it's independent, and ultimately is making a difference in clinician knowledge transfer, as well as performance improvement, as well as quality improvement. So there was a fairly robust discussion. Some of the fears that still exist is that our commercial supporter colleagues are taking a position on one extreme where they're saying, you know what, we're simply not going to report anything as it relates to CME, because our understanding is that CME is exempt by virtue of what CMS has laid out in the law, as well as in the FAQs and some of the clarity that they try to provide in the first final rule and the second final rule. And then other supporters are saying we're going to report everything when it comes to education. And that way they're taking the position that if they report everything, There won't be any confusion, and that's simply the easiest and most efficient way to do this. What we're learning is that both of those positions are actually, there needs to be some softening, if you will, and that a harder look needs to be taken at those. Because number one, while the CME is exempt in Sunshine, the way it's laid out, taking a complete polar approach to it isn't necessarily the right thing to do in what you require from a reporting standpoint or not require. And those that are asking and saying they're going to report everything, actually there's some fear that they may open themselves up for providing too much information, which actually works against the whole issue around what they know and don't know as it relates to the education. So it is as the panel defined, it's clearly laid out right now in the second final ruling that there's and through the FAQs that there is clarity now, and that's starting in this year, 2016, and reporting starts in March of 2017. CME-related payments are only reportable if the manufacturer determines that the payment or the transfer of value meets the definition of an indirect payment, and the manufacturer is aware of the covered recipient and directed that payment or instructed that payment, required that payment to a specific individual. And because commercial supporters don't direct us to do that, they don't influence us when they support our grants, then theoretically the CME community is exempt. But it is still a very touchy subject. It's still going to be discussed at lots of meetings in the coming year as people really try to figure out what their position is around the Physician Payment Sunshine Act. But again, the feeling that more transparency is good for our community, I think everybody was on board with that, both the provider community and the supporter community as well. The other thing I want to say is from a Sunshine, and as we talk about advocacy, a reminder, and this is just something that we're getting involved in on the advocacy committee, is that the ACEhp, completely unrelated here, but I did want to bring it up. The ACEhp has posted a call for comment. They are revising their menu of new criteria for CME providers for accreditation with commendation. And this is a really positive step forward. They're trying to essentially really challenge us in the provider community to do things and organize our programs, if you will, in such a way that we can all achieve accreditation with commendation. And this new menu that they've put out for public comment, some of it is really, really, I think, great, especially for academic medical centers and health systems like University of Utah, Intermountain Healthcare, but also even for the providers like and societies like medical specialty societies and medical education, certified medical education companies like MedIQ. So the comment period is February 16th. Please take a look at it. You can go to the ACCME's website and provide comment. We're urging everybody in the Alliance community to please respond to that. If you could advance to the next slide, please. This whole conversation around relevance and value is critical right now. And so this conversation that at the Alliance kind of came up in a lot of different presentations, but essentially it boils down to this. While we as CME providers, continuing education providers, have developed and delivered high quality education that has in fact made a difference in improving clinician knowledge and competence and performance and quality as well as patient outcomes, the argument is, and the criticism is that we've not done a very good job in telling that story. And there are some that believe that there's a disconnect when the end beneficiary of the work that we do in the CME community, that being the patient, really doesn't have any idea that we exist. And so the argument is made that we are not doing a good enough telling our story and being able to really articulate the value of the work that we're doing. It seems to be understood amongst us in the provider community. It seems to be understood by those clinicians that are required to participate and get CME or continuing education credits. But outside of the sort of internal healthcare ecosystem, there's not a lot of people that really truly understand the value of what we do. And this is why we continue to take flack, if you will, from those on the outside who believe that number one, we're not effective in the delivery of this education. We're not making a difference, as well as those who believe that pharmaceutical-funded CME somehow is biased and ultimately is marketing and promotion and not really true fair, balanced, independently developed education. And so this whole discussion around how do we demonstrate value really brings to light the need for us to establish our relevance and the role that we play as education providers and our contribution to the improvement of healthcare in this country. And then to be able to demonstrate that value across the board to multiple stakeholders, and that is obviously to ourselves within the community, but also those policymakers, the media, the consumers, the advocacy groups, all of those folks that are on the outside of what we do who don't have a clear understanding of the role that we play. And this is a big part of what we're doing within the Alliance community, within membership, within the foundation, within education, and certainly on advocacy to really help tell the value story of how and what impact we're having in improving healthcare. On the Alliance website, if you go to the advocacy tab, you will find two things there that help tell this story. One is a campaign called Why We Matter, and you can hear testimonials from academic medical center providers, medical society providers, medical education companies, commercial supporters, all the stakeholders in our enterprise sharing their stories of why we matter and the success that they have had in helping improve healthcare through education. And that's a really powerful opportunity, I think, for us to get our arms around the value proposition. The other side is there's a resource on the Alliance website, and it's the call for papers component of the advocacy site. On that tab, you'll find over 50 published articles, manuscripts, and peer-reviewed journals around the efficacy and the value of certified continuing education and continuing medical education. And so we're urging two things. We're urging all of our members in the Alliance to, A, access those resources to help understand and to better tell the story of the value that we bring to this equation. And secondly, please contribute anything that you've done that has been published on the work that you've done at University of Utah or within the entire system throughout the state of Utah. Please bring those ideas, those manuscripts, those published articles to the Alliance so that we can get them posted and share them with the rest of the community. You can advance to the next slide, please. This was an interesting conversation around funding, and again, depending on how the education you develop gets funded, really is, the points of view around this were very diverse and, again, very interesting. So we looked at funding. In the past, funding has always been a headwind. And so if you look at it from an external standpoint, if you receive funding from medical device or pharmaceutical companies, you know that there's been a 30% reduction in that funding in the CME enterprise over the past 5 years. However, last year, the ACEhp reported that there was actually a 2% uptick. It's not a big one, but I think where it's the headwind or the tailwind behind that, I think where you can find some hope is that the supporter community is continuing to fund continuing medical education and seems to be wanting to put more money to work to help advance high quality, fair balance, independently developed education. So that was, I think, a promising side that people felt good about. The headwind on this, though, is that we're hearing a lot from our academic medical center partners and our medical specialty societies and association partners that funding internally for their departments continues to get reduced. And the challenge for these departments and the CME programs within these organizations to continue to deliver high-quality education is really challenged. So this kind of feeds back to the slide prior where everybody in our session kind of came to grips with the reality is that if we're not able within academia or within the specialty societies, if we're not able to establish our relevance and tell our value story better, we're at risk of losing funding to continue to do the great work that we do in our program. And a lot of the folks in the room really agree that this was a continued challenge. So on one side, we see just a slight increase in commercial support funding for those that are tapping into that as a resource to fund their education. But again, we're seeing it as a strong headwind as departments continue to face budget challenges and perhaps some relevance and value challenges in trying to get their story across. We're seeing some reduction in funding, reduction in headcount, and some of those departments are becoming resource starved and hurting their ability to deliver quality education. So this is something everyone's paying close attention to. We've heard a lot about the quality improvement, the QIE roadmap, the quality improvement education roadmap that the Alliance got behind a few years back. And this has taken on, really over the past few years, it's really taken on an interesting to mention in that when this first was rolled out a few years ago, there was a lot of pushback. And the pushback was that the way it was being articulated to the community, to the membership, was that people felt that we as a community were essentially saying, you know what, this whole quality improvement efforts that the Alliance is pursuing right now essentially is leaving a lot of providers behind. That the message was that if you're not doing QI education, if you're not being a part of the quality improvement movement, that the education that you're developing in the knowledge transfer side of things really isn't relevant anymore, and that all of us, all the providers and supporters for that matter, need to step up and understand that this is the way of the future. Well, a few years ago, that rubbed everybody the wrong way, and the panel pointed out that because we had just come through the performance improvement, the PI challenges of the years past, that coming at this community again with now quality improvement really created a challenge for many of the providers. But the simple fact is this. At the end of the day, the Affordable Care Act has provided us in the CME community truly with a roadmap, if you will, for us to align the great work that we do in the enterprise with the changes that are taking place in healthcare across this country. And my argument is, and I'm not the only one, there's people a lot smarter than me that are arguing this, but the argument is as you move from a volume to value-based healthcare model, that education, continuing medical education for clinicians, ultimately is the tool or the resource to help drive that transformation. This transformation can't just get there by legislation alone. It can't just simply be a mandate from either the federal government or a state government or the C-suites within a system. This has to, the way we get there is through education. And so this whole notion around the quality improvement education roadmap, as it has evolved now, what we're beginning to realize, and I think people are starting to get their arms around and getting very comfortable, is that we have a seat at this table. We have an enormous amount of work to do, but we have a seat at this table to, A, recognize that not everything is QI, first of all, but where QI can work, we have to be an active partner with that system, with the QI department that exists within that system. And we have to be able to demonstrate that the tools and resources we bring to the table can not only help make the transformation towards quality, but sustain that transformation downstream and in the long term. So the discussion that took place in this panel and the discussions afterwards and other sessions is really for our community to understand the power that we have, the role that we play to truly make a difference in the enterprise. And we're hopeful that the Alliance and the Foundation ultimately are going to be creating training for all of us in the provider community that want to do this great work so that we can be trained to do it correctly. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, in the time I have left, education design, this was a big issue. People feel that we've got great opportunities right now, that this is truly a tailwind, that there's so much innovation in the marketplace and how we deliver education that it feels the community is really excited about that. But the cautions around this are that we cannot simply innovate just for innovation's sake. And for years and years, a lot of us feel that the shiny new thing that came out, we all wanted to get behind and leverage that and integrate that into our educational design in order to make a difference. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And so the plea here and where we went with this discussion is very, very simple. It has to be learner-centric. Education design cannot be built in a vacuum and then delivered to a community. It has to be built from within the practice, from within the system, from the healthcare providers themselves in order for us to be customer or learner-centric so that the education that we're developing is actually relevant and can make a difference. And we have to align this design with the new practice models that are taking place as a function of the Affordable Care Act. So the ability to design and deliver education within a patient-centered medical home framework, for those that are familiar with that model, and we're doing a lot of work there, is very, very different than the work that you do when you put something out on the web and you hope that 5,000 people come online and experience that webcast. We're developing and delivering education from within those practices because we understand the gaps and the barriers and the challenges that they face. And we're not simply educating a clinician anymore. We have to change our thinking and educate a patient care team. All of the stakeholders on the care team need to be our focal point, not simply a clinician. And this was a big part of this discussion. go ahead and go to this next. Okay, great. So in this slide presentation that we delivered, and you can have copies of this, we provided resources. So there's some resources on Sunshine, there's resources on funding and QI, and resources for educational design, articles that you can read, some tools and resources that you could implement. As you can tell, I'm very, very enthusiastic and feel passionate about the work that we do in the enterprise. And this was a really great session that we were able to deliver and share with you today on some of the things that we're seeing, trends that are headwinds and tailwinds, but ultimately things that we can harness to continue to deliver the great work that we're doing in the enterprise. So thanks again for the time, and I'll turn it back over.
Great.
To the moderator.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was an excellent presentation. I will be sending out your slides to everyone at the conclusion of the webinar. Next, we're going to have Vanessa Ross, who has an MHA, CMP, and CHCP. She's the Director of Continuing Medical Education at Des Moines University, and I believe she hails from Utah originally, or at least used to work here. So I will turn it over to you. Let me just pass you the ball. Are you there, Vanessa? Okay, Vanessa, I'm going to pass you the presentation ball. So if you have any slides, you can just project them on the screen. Otherwise, we can just hear from you directly. All right, it looks like we might be having some technical difficulties again with Vanessa, so I will contact her. But in the meantime, we'll have Mike come up with his presentation, so I'll pass you the ball, Mike. And Mike, again, is a part of In-Around Healthcare's CME department, and he does some great outcomes work within the field out here.
Hey, can we all see my screen? Yes, okay, great. Okay, one second. So like Daniel said, I am the data analyst for continuing medical education. I had a really good opportunity to come out to this conference this year and be part of a presentation on how to do research, just to be able to teach beginning research topics and stuff like that. It was really cool to see how many people really took to that and really responded to that. I think it really helped also to be able to see that sometimes we look at CME here at Intermountain as just this little department, but it was so awesome to see that CME is bigger than that. There's tons of people involved, and interestingly enough, we all share similar concerns and problems, and we have similar goals to deliver and provide quality education. So just right off the bat, I just want to say that I have no financial relationships to disclose. And the session I wanted to talk about today that I had the fortune of sitting in wasn't actually something I had planned on attending. My schedule was all planned to be attending outcomes analyst-related sessions, but Sarah Ann, the director for CME here in Intermountain, asked that I sit on this one, and it turns out it was one of the most interesting sessions that I sat on to listen. And this was called Dream the Impossible Dream, Measuring Commercial Influence. It was given by some people from the American Society of Cataract and Refractive Surgery, and that included their director, program manager, and their education assistant. One of the things they were trying to do with their program was to be able to eliminate the personal perception of bias. It was very interesting to me because they went about it a different way than we've been doing it here, and so I'm wondering if there are some things here that are applicable. They were trying to eliminate things that were defined by the ACEhp and by their own organization as non-compliant behavior. They were trying to also weed out the personal perception of bias, which is a little bit more tricky than it sounds. Their goal was to identify what was truly biased perceptions versus what people personally felt. And so it's really interesting to think about that distinction. One way that they did that was every year they would have a training for their physicians and providers in order to educate them and remind them what conflict of interest actually is. I find this pretty interesting because maybe you forget and maybe you have your own ideas about what constitutes as commercial influence or whatnot, but to be able to have this education that they did every year in order to define what does conflict of interest mean in CME and how do they define that in plain words. Most importantly, how do you resolve those conflicts? And I just thought it was a really good way to prep your providers and stuff. And I wonder if doing this would maybe decrease the amount of perceived bias, just because you have the definition here, you have the parameters on how to define it. And so it was just really unique that they were doing this. They also presented the way that they were measuring bias. And this is familiar to me because essentially we ask a yes or no question, do you perceive bias? And then maybe you'll get some sort of commentary on how do they, if they perceive bias, why or why not. But yes or no it's so binary. And I really think there are more, bias goes a little more deeper than that. There are more explanations than yes or no. And so as I've thought about this presentation since coming back, I've looked into a couple of things. My background's in psychology, so I've been beginning to look at some of the theories that are out there and how people perceive bias. And this just goes to show. Here are 12 theories out there on where bias comes from, and to break it down to just a yes or no question, I think it does a disservice instead of really getting at the true cause of why someone could perceive bias. The tool they presented and what they used is very interesting. Not only are they asking, do you perceive bias, yes or no, they're asking specifically why you perceive bias. And questions range from failure to disclose relevant financial interest at the start of the presentation, corporate product logos or product images on slides, failure to distinguish when opinions and recommendations are based solely on personal experience, inconsistent reference to products, and failure to provide both positive and negative studies. And last, I thought it was really interesting that they included this, which was none of these. However, I feel that all presenters with financial interests have bias in general. And honestly, I don't think that's necessarily like a negative choice, but it's interesting that they have it on there. Now, the director mentioned that when they implemented this at the end of 2013, they really did see some changes in behavior as far as how people responded to their survey. Prior to that time, for example, on the graph on the upper left, they had about 77% perceived bias, and it went down over time, but it significantly dropped down in 2014, 2015. Same thing with the graph underneath as far as they did it again at the end of the year when it was winter to see if there was any changes. They were also able to look at whether or not per session how many people perceive bias. And it's interesting to see that the majority don't perceive bias. And it's interesting because when we tease it out a little bit more and we ask, just going back to that this rubric that they're using, when you tease it out, yes or no isn't exactly descriptive, and the fact that they were able to separate these things out into these other categories really made a difference for them on whether or not a person who was taking the course or in the course was able to perceive there was bias or not. And so it looks like it definitely is working. I've got another 2 graphs here that they also gave. Here we have percent of sessions with no report of bias, which significantly increased. There, over half by 2015 did not perceive bias in their sessions. The sessions over 50% did not perceive to have any kind of bias. And as you can see on the other graph, it was going down. And one thing I liked about the measurement they were using is because, if you know that there is bias for a specific presentation, in order to rectify it, where do you step in and say, okay, maybe we need to kick out more slides, or maybe we need to make sure they have a disclosure page, or something like that. And what they were able to do with the rubric they were using is they were able to see, okay, well, in 2015, what were our primary sources of where there was bias perceived? And here on this chart, they were able to graph it and be able to point out that it's posters most of the time. And if I recall correctly, some of the commentary related to this was oftentimes on posters and presentations, there was usually a logo or something like that. And so it's really, I think, important to be able to separate out what exactly it is that is causing bias and identify that instead of taking some sort of overwhelming approach to try to fix everything versus just focusing, for example, here on posters. And so here are some thoughts as I've been been doing a literature review on bias, and it makes me wonder, is bias always bad? And I'm not sure if I have a good answer on that, because sometimes, as this researcher has pointed out, it's unconscious and unintentional. Sometimes people just see that if there's any kind of financial conflict of interest, that automatically means bias or denotes that there's some sort of corruption or something like that. But it's not like that. And here, this quote from this researcher says, although it may seem to be intuitively and easily recognized that people are biased in assessing themselves and others, the fact is that these biases are often unconscious and unintentional, and it's not intuitive and is largely underappreciated. So taking a step further, if the perception of bias is something that you can't really measure because you don't know if it's conscious or or intentional, how do you do that? How do you measure that? And I think there's an opportunity here to start looking into the kind of research into behavior here to see if maybe there is a way that we can address these biases that are coming out unconscious and that are unintentional. Some of the things that this researcher says that we need to be looking into is education for just like this society was doing as far as being able to denote what was conflict of interest. This researcher also mentioned that penalties was sometimes some organizations use that, and disclosures, for example, and limiting gifts by size or use. But at the end of the day, their point was policymakers and CME departments that we may benefit from recognizing and accommodating a more psychologically nuanced view of conflicts of interest in our interventions, and just being able to define what that is and helping other people. As I've been thinking about this, with this idea of is bias always bad, it makes me think that maybe we need to be looking at some bias as acceptable, which sounds a little crazy because we don't want any bias, but to be fair, maybe we need to be able to look at bias on a scale and only intervene when it's out of control, coming up with some sort of statistical process control chart to sample these small groups of courses and events, and be able to say, okay, what's the average score here? If we were to break up the bias survey question into multiple sub-questions, when do we actually step in? And I think there's something to be said about being able to step in when something's out of control outside of the average and things like that. So that's definitely something that really got my brain thinking about how we could better assess bias and how to identify when we need to make any changes. It was a really good and informative session, and I was really glad to be there. And I just have some works cited here, and that's it.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. That was a great presentation. If anyone ever has any data needs, Mike is the person to go to. He's quite brilliant with it. Okay, and lastly, we'll try popping over to Vanessa again. So let me try to pass you the ball, Vanessa, and just make sure that your little mute sign is off. Okay, Vanessa, are you able to hear us? Let's see, let me try this again. So Vanessa, I see your name has a little red X in front of it. If you can try hitting the unmute button on the right-hand corner of the WebEx box. What's that? Okay, let me... Sorry, everyone, just bear with us. Well, it looks like we are having some technical difficulties, so we will try to connect with Vanessa another time. In the meantime, as maybe she will be able to figure out a quick fix. Does anyone have any questions from the first two presenters, from either Scott Weber's presentation or Mike's?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name's Teresa. I'm with Ogden Surgical Medical Society. I always like Mike's presentations. I was at the last UMA Alliance meeting where he spoke, and the information that he gives is always relevant to things I'm thinking about. Anyway, are his slides going to be available? I was really interested on the old bias versus the new bias and how that's presented. And if I can use that, the new biases that he has on my surveys of my physicians at the CME conferences.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike just gave me the thumbs up. He will send me his presentation, and I'll send that out along with Scott's presentation.
And how would we get that?
I'll email it out to everyone.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you for that. Okay. Well, everyone, thank you for attending. If anyone has any thoughts or ideas that they'd like to share now for the annual meeting, please feel free to. Or you can always email me at daniel.sowards@imail.org. Okay. And again, Vanessa, if you can hear us, we will definitely tap your knowledge another time. We're sorry for the technical difficulties. Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. And again, the annual meeting is May 19th. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This meeting is now ending. Thank you for calling.